Hello everyone, on behalf of Embarcadero Technologies, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar with Karen Lopez on data governance and stewardship. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Shweta Singh and I'm the GoToWebinar organizer for today's event. Joining me from Embarcadero is Solomon Waters. Over to you, Sol.
Thanks, Shweta. Hi everyone, this is Sol Waters from Embarcadero. I manage our sales engineering team here at Embarcadero Technologies, and in a little while I'll give you a quick tour of ER Studio. But first, of course, Karen Lopez is going to talk to us about data governance and data stewardship. Karen brings to the table over 20 years of experience in the data management world and is also a longtime Embarcadero product user. She's an active blogger. We'll see the URL for the blog on the slides, and also a social media user where you can follow her at @DataCheck. I think that what sums Karen up is that she loves helping people make their data programs more valuable to the business, and we're going to hear a little bit more about that now. So Karen, please take it away.
Thanks, Saul. Also, I want to start out by talking to everyone today, saying I'm so happy you joined me. I don't know what the weather's like where you are, but here in Toronto we're experiencing our mandatory 2 weeks of summer right now here at the beginning. Last weekend was our long holiday weekend. But me being a good Mexican-American Canadian, I'm going to celebrate Labor Day that's coming up in the U.S. And I hope wherever you are in the world that you're having great weather and a great day. And I really appreciate that you're taking the time to spend just an hour with us to talk about something that I think is really important, but I hope that we can present it in a way that's really engaging. I'm looking through the attendee list, and I'm so happy to see a lot of people that I've met personally, who I know through social media, also people who I don't know you yet. I hope every single one of you will ask questions or make a comment via the Q&A. That's, to me, the ultimate success of one of these webinars, is to not have me just sit up here and lecture, but to engage you, make you think, and also hear what you have to say on this subject. To me, that's what makes for a great, entertaining time to talk about something that we're all pretty passionate about. I'm going to go through some slides, and then Saul's going to give you some demos, and you can ask your questions or make your comments anytime in the Q&A. So one of the things is this particular webinar is based on a workshop that we did just outside of Washington, D.C., and I called that workshop Enterprise Discovery, but we're going to see why I called it that in just a few minutes. So there's my bio. Much of it what Saul covered already, and I just wanted to mention that that if you want to follow me or friend me or LinkedIn to me, just mention that you met me here on this webinar. That allows me to say, yes, that's someone I want to link to. Like I said, all your comments and questions, I see we have a few of them. Again, I want to see a whole bunch in that Q&A. No comment or question is too irreverent or contentious for me. I love when people want to say, no, think about it this way. So this is one of the reasons why I called it Enterprise Discovery at my workshop. It just so happened, many of you know I'm kind of a space geek, that the same week that I was in D.C. to help Embarcadero talk to some U.S. federal government agencies and some commercial interests about data governance was the same time that the Space Shuttle Orbiter Discovery was arriving to its new home at the Smithsonian at the Air and Space Museum. So I got to go watch that. This is one of my photos for that. So I'm going to put gratuitously a bunch of space shuttle pictures in here for this. And just remember, and it's called Enterprise because Discovery was replacing Enterprise at the Smithsonian. So today we're just going to talk a little bit about data governance, stewardship, and compliance, and then maybe some of the gaps that we are experiencing in helping making those programs a success in our organizations. But first we're going to start out with a poll. I'd like for you to just go ahead and answer what you think you really are. I'm not really so concerned what your title is, but who you are, what your mother raised you to be, and what your role is. Again, not your title. So we see we got lots of votes. Only not even half of you have voted. For those of you off doing your email and being on Twitter and answering a question from a developer, just pop on over here and answer this poll. Okay, 3/4 of you have voted. Nope, less than 3/4. Okay. So what it looks like is that, and Saul, can you see the results of the poll? There's nothing I have to do here.
I do not see the results of the poll.
Okay, so I'm not sure. I don't see anything on how to share it. Oh,
Yeah,
I think I have to close it.
Saul, if you just click on the plus sign in the polls, you'll be able to see that.
Oh, is it off on the right?
Yes, correct.
Okay, so everyone should be able to see the polls off on the right. I'm going to, now that still got some people voting, looks like we only got half the people, 85%. I'm going to go ahead and close it. And so I can see it, I can read it off to you, that of our attendees who voted, which was 85%, is that 60% of us are data architectures and modelers, 6% are business analysts, 13% are project managers or project managers or managers, 9% are compliance or steward or governance people, which is a good fit for this, and 12% other. So if those of you who voted other, and if you're an astronaut or someone else who joined this, if you want to put in the Q&A what your other titles or roles are, then that would help me out too. So we'll go on to the next thing. Now our next question is another poll about data governance. Oops. Let me go back. I'm going to go ahead and launch that poll. And what I'm asking now is, what is the status of your organization's data governance, compliance, stewardship programs or activities are? And while you're doing that, I'll mention what other people have said, that their roles are portfolio architecture, application and technology rationalization. That's quite a title. I hope you have big business cards. Then we have metadata repository librarian, that's good, and a do-it-all DBA. I thought all DBAs did it all. Anyway. So 70% of you have voted. What's the status of your data governance program? And I just want to get a few more of you. We're up to 78%, 79, 80. Okay. Looks like most of you are done voting. And what we had is about 25% of you have no current program in process. 32% are thinking about it, 36% are starting it. That's a huge chunk of people whose organizations haven't quite established a data governance program or are starting it. 24% established and 1% canceled or ended. And one of the reasons why I put that canceled or ended in there is I have come across stories of organizations that have started it and for a variety of reasons haven't been able to continue the effort. Sometimes it's just, budget cuts and layoffs and the down economy. Some of these things are the first things to go. We tend to, when things get tough, we as organizations tend to focus on just keeping everybody alive and breathing. Maybe not doing a lot of new development or changes, just moving into an operational zone. Thank you for the reminder about showing my presentation. I have to remember to do that after the poll. Hopefully you can see the slides now. One of the options, someone says one of the options could have been in the process, so I guess that's established for me. But yeah, I could see how that would be that. And the reason I ask this question is, I go to something like a DAMA conference, an Enterprise Data World or a Data Governance Conference, and it really makes it feel like every other organization in the world is actually doing this and has been doing it for a long time. But it turns out, in real life, there are a lot of organizations that don't have a formal program for that. We're going to talk about that. So why are we here today? Well, as I said, this is based on a workshop that we did just outside of DC. Had a lot of fun doing that. And it was a small group that discussed some of the importance and effectiveness of data governance and stewardship and compliance efforts. And I'm lumping these all together. I realize that they are different programs, they're different activities, but they are all kind of interrelated. Stewardship is often the first step towards, establishing a data stewardship just so you can have the business accountability for data active and that often then spawns onto a more formal data governance program. Compliance is something, is really an external reason why organizations look towards data stewardship or compliance, or data stewardship or governance. They look towards those things because that's one way of ensuring you have compliance, because we can't just have cowboy coders and cowboy data people arbitrarily making decisions about the integrity, the quality, the reliability, the accuracy, the availability of our data. Is we recognize that a lot of compliance legislation came about because we were doing too many ad hoc things and now needed to do more formal methods. And during this workshop, we also shared tricks and tips about compliance, and that's also one of my goals for this session here. And we also talked about how Embarcadero products can support these efforts, and I'm hoping that Saul will show us some of the ways that they do, although that could be a complete other webinar in itself. So our goals for today is for us to continue this discussion and to encourage all of us to think about how, even if we don't have a full-blown enterprise-wide corporate global data governance process going, how we can think about putting more compliance efforts into our normal solutions delivery processes. So we'll start at the beginning. So of course I went to datagovernance.com, which is part of the Data Governance Institute run by my friend Gwen Thomas. And this is one of their definitions of data governance. And we talked about, from that definition, about what did we like and not like about this definition. And some of the feedback we got from this one is it was an awfully formal definition, and it didn't seem to tie in data governance to making the business more successful, although to me that's the most important part of anything we do as data professionals. Is that, and when I say business, I'm including government, I'm including not-for-profit, I'm just talking about our organizational goals and missions. One of the other comments we got was this particular definition isn't so solutions-oriented. And I find that's true for a lot of data standards and things that we do, that we tend to be the world's worst marketers from the data side or the compliance side, is that we want to talk in terms of some goals, but we need to be able to define these things in a way that shows the business, that shows the end users that we want to do this not just because we think data should be perfect, but because we understand that there's a real business value in limiting risk of incorrect data, poor quality data, that these sort of things impact the customer directly or the citizens directly. So while I really like this definition, I'd love to see more about how it supports the business. Yeah, so one comment is the definition doesn't address a problem being solved, just what is, so what. That's kind of my thing, is I'd love to see us think in terms when we write these definitions of things of what problem are we trying to solve. And Dawn is also mentioning that a real challenge is to figure out how we get the rest of those not doing data stuff into the EDW and data governance conferences. Very good point, and I think one of the ways that we recruit people into thinking, not people who aren't just data professionals into this, is really we have to tie this to business goals. So one of the things we did during the workshop, I'm a big fan of Post-it note activities during my sessions, and I put up sort of a what I learned as a SWAT diagram, which is where you take, basically it's a quadrant, where you take two axes and put extremes on either end and have people vote. So I asked, for data governance in your organization, how important is it? From anywhere from meh, which is not so much, to important, and how well are we doing it? Anywhere from poor to well. And people got up and put their Post-it notes on the board and voted where on these axes. And pretty much, from my hand-scribbled notes, most of the Post-it notes sort of made it into this range, where we all felt it was important and where we but we didn't think we were doing such a great job of that. And I think we would all feel that way, especially if we're data or governance people, like maybe it'll never be good enough. But we talked about some of the reasons why things weren't going as well. And some of that feedback was that we were all still in this process, and what we saw from our poll of getting it started and trying to make it more adopted within our organization. So we had established programs, or we're thinking of establishing programs, but there was still a lot of pushback. One of the things that's going to happen as a result of this workshop and as a result of this webinar is that we'll be releasing a white paper that I wrote called The 5 Things to Do Before You Start Any Data Governance Program. And that's where I talk about what I think are the 5 essential things that organizations and that we need to do before we even start a data governance program. And so I'm sure that information, Saul, do you know if that's going to be released to people who have attended? Is it going to be available for download?
Yeah, I believe the answer is going to be both, that we'll be sending this out to the attendees as well as making it available on the website.
Yeah, excellent. So one of the comments was, importance must be measured in project commitment, not manager lip service and one-liners. Gee, I have no idea what you're talking about. Okay, that was snark. Yeah, importance. So one of the things I talk about is what's something important to a business. And in my course on sort of selling all this data stuff to management is I talk about how we data people do a lousy job selling the benefits that we can provide to an organization. And that's because we tend to focus on things that the business doesn't think is important. What does the business think is important? Business thinks these things are important. Increasing income, reducing cost, increasing customers, or whatever it is your metric for being successful that way. Maybe it's increasing citizenship satisfaction. Maybe it's increasing downloads. I don't know what those are for your organization. So increasing costs, or increasing revenue, decreasing costs, increasing customers, and reducing risk. And one of the best risks that you can reduce for your company is ROI. Why would you want to do that? Because in this definition, ROI means risk of incarceration. So some compliance issues like data privacy outside the U.S. and some financial sensitivity data, that if your CIO isn't doing a great job protecting customers and their data, they can go to jail. So one of the most motivating factors we can do as data professionals is to keep our CIO out of jail. Just remember that. You should actually go right now and send an email to your CIO telling them that your job is to keep him out of jail, her out of jail, and see what he says. So then we talked about data stewardship, and everyone can get a copy of the white paper when it's available. It'll be available for download, and I'll be sharing that link. Great, thanks for the question. So I went and grabbed from Wikipedia some definitions of data steward responsibilities, and this is what Wikipedia had. I like the first one, has a clear and unambiguous data element definition. You know, to those of us in the data world, that's pretty much the pinnacle of what we would love to have. You know, it doesn't conflict with other things, has clearly enumerated value definitions, still being used, meaning we're not carrying around data that we don't use anymore and don't need. We use it consistently. We have adequate documentation, and we know the origin and sources of authority on each element. So some of the feedback that we talked about with this definition was that it was overly focused on data elements, because of course data stewardship is more than just that. For instance, the normal most important question are things like deciding who's a customer or what an order is or what product is. You know, the fundamental essential parts of our business are some of the hardest things to define. I liked this definition as a subset of data steward responsibilities, but I also felt that it was a little bit focused on data elements. Now this does come from Wikipedia, which means last person to update at one, which isn't always a great way to define something to the whole world. I also thought it might be too strict. I think some of the reasons why we fail in data stewardship is that we tell people the only successful data stewardship outcome we can have is one single version of the truth for every piece of data. But the real world doesn't work that way. It doesn't even work that way in your own home. Why should we expect it to work in a corporation with 100,000 people? Yeah, so another comment, all various definitions in use in various parts of the organization. And that's, it does give insight to real data governance. It does. So I'm trying to balance out the fact that while this isn't ideal, I mean, we really should think about having a common corporate or organizational definition of, say, country. But I happen to know that what we call a country, it varies, like whose definition of country. There's all kinds of political issues in dealing with a list of countries. That's why so many organizations go with the ISO standards for a list of countries. It also could mean, is it current countries or all the countries? Like what if you were born in a country that no longer exists? You might not show up in that ISO list of countries. What if you have to check into your flight? I saw this one posted on Twitter the other day, but your nationality, the country that you are a citizen of, wasn't on the list. Now you can't check into your flight. So I enjoy reading these goals for a data steward, but they're not quite flexible enough to me to be in the real world, and that was what we talked about. The other comment I got on the data stewardship was it was focused a bit much on what a data steward does instead of their deciding and authorizing role. Like at least on most of my projects, the data steward doesn't do a lot of this stuff. The data steward ensures that these things happen. So we did the same Post-it note example where I asked the group, how important is data stewardship and how well are we doing it? We got similar responses, although a little bit further along on that we're doing it better. And the discussion we had about that was that it's probably related to the fact that data stewardship programs usually precede data governance programs, and that so we've been talking about doing data stewardship and had that as terminology and had identified those for at least a portion of our enterprise for a lot longer time. So then we went on to talk about FISMA, which is a federal government standard, compliance program, and some other compliance. So this is a definition from NIST on FISMA of what this entails. So the first one, again, I love it. Categorize the information to be protected. That seems to be the first step of every governance and compliance and stewardship and data management program that's in the beginning of time, is that we can't manage or govern or steward or take care of or make big data if we don't even know what it is. And yet when we ask people about how well that they have a good grasp of their data, a lot of times that percentage is, people don't have a good confidence level. So we continue to build information systems, to build databases, to build data integrations, to build messages, and yet we don't really do a good job as an IT profession in making sure that we understand what data we're managing. Every time there's a data breach, you see this data breach announcement, and then they say, we're pretty sure that there was no credit card information or sensitive information, and then too many times the follow-up is, oh yeah, there was some sensitive information, credit card information, some social security numbers and all of that, but not too much. To me, that's why this is the focus of the standard, which if you look at the rest of the items, baseline controls, document the security plan, implement security, authorize information, and then monitor it, this is really focused for the most part on data protection. And we talked about how people felt about this definition. One of the things that someone brought up is that most data architects, most data professionals are involved in step one and very rarely are involved or understand the tasks that happen in the rest of the 9 parts of it. And I have a problem with that. I think we as data professionals should do more than just categorize or catalog our data. I think our role should be not just about describing data or setting up business rules, but also ensuring that standard security and compliance issues, especially privacy ones, are implemented correctly as we understood that data. So too many times we do the throw the data over the wall, the data model over the wall, and then we don't want to be involved in the rest of this. And I know it's a matter of prioritizing our time, but to me, our role should be also protecting data, not just describing it. So the next thing we talked about is if you have a methodology for development or for delivering solutions, have all these compliance and governance methods been integrated with it? So some of the feedback I got, which also reflects what I see, is that if there is a methodology or a process for our development and deployment efforts, a lot of times compliance or governance is either managed by a completely separate group or it's perceived as being something you do after the project's finished. But we know that you can't do that, that we ought to be identifying sensitive data and risks plans in our project charters, that requirements, privacy issues are a requirement, not a technical issue. You can't protect privacy after you've built and collected the data. It has to be addressed during the collection, during establishing requirements for it, establishing the granularity, establishing how it can be shared. And the same thing ripples through all the other processes of this simplified development method here. Don has a comment. One of the things we have to do is take personal responsibility to learn the business so that we are more credible and taken in the confidence of our business peers. Then we are more likely to be included in more project steps. I totally support that. People will ask me in my courses, they'll say something like, how can we get developers and DBAs to be more concerned about data quality? And my answer to that is, first of all, you should be sitting next to them and working with them on a regular basis. But the real issue is, don't spend a whole lot of effort trying to convince the implementers that this requirement needs to be done. What we need to be doing is focusing, and the much bigger bang for the buck is to convince the business people that they need to be telling IT that we need to be involved in these projects and that these steps need to happen. If the business is calling for it and the business funds IT, it has this funny way of making it happen. So some other compliance things we discussed was privacy and personally identifiable information, financial data, health data, and even IT methods. So things like SOX and Sarbanes-Oxley and these things focus on how we go about managing data and developing for data and deploying solutions. And it's all another type of compliance. So I'm going through this fast. This is like a half-day workshop, and I'm covering it in just a few minutes. So where's our metadata? So all of these standards talked about categorizing your data, knowing your data. In my white paper, I talk about knowing what you know about your data and knowing what you don't know about it. So we talked about right now in most organizations, if we manage any metadata at all, so characteristics about the data, it's typically done in data models. It may be done in a metadata repository if you're really lucky, but for the vast majority of people that have any kind of formal metadata management, it's done in data modeling. We talked about who's responsible for logical modeling, who's responsible for physical models, how are those data models governed, who does DDL, who's generating the databases, who does the first cut, who does final. Do we have version control, monitoring, who resolves discrepancies? So in a typical old-fashioned traditional waterfall method, the answer to these questions would be a data architect modeler does logical modeling, then throws that over a wall, usually to a development DBA or a developer who takes that logical model and may or may not use it to build a physical model of the database. And the data architect is not involved at all in any of the decisions, compromises, denormalization, performance tuning, the deleting of tables or columns, the addition of tables and columns and repeating groups. So there's virtually no data model governance between logical and physical. And then a DBA or someone or a developer may or may not use that physical model to generate some DDL, a script to build a database. The first cut is probably the last cut until someone fixes bugs. There may or may not be version control of that script or the models. Virtually no one monitors to see if the business requirements established in the logical model were actually implemented in the physical model or the database, and therefore no one knows about the discrepancies. That's really sad. Yeah, shouldn't we be able to put a disclaimer on our data models? So that's the old school 1980s way of data modeling, and I still see a lot of organizations doing this. But to me, this is how it should be done. Logical modeling and physical modeling should be done as a collaborative effort between a data architect, information architect, data modeler, whatever you want to call that, and a design and developer, whether that is another data architect who specializes in physical design and modeling, whether that's a development DBA or a developer, but someone who understands the cost, benefits, and risks of preparing a physical model, and that there's data governance, data model governance there, not a heavy process, but some sort of process that understands that changes and enhancements to the models need to be consistent across the models and need to conform to what the business has decided is a good data model and therefore a good data standard. I typically do the first cut DDL to make sure that the physical model and the DDL and the script are done, but I work closely with my development and production DBAs to ensure that we get to a database that meets everyone's needs for performance and maintenance and business. And we have version control. In fact, I fight for using the same version control that everyone else uses. I also use tools such as Change Manager from Embarcadero or our scripts to monitor changes to the databases throughout the environments like dev, QA, pre-production, production, so that I can see what changes are being made and I can highlight any discrepancies and so that we can resolve them through our normal resolution process. That to me is a process that works and doesn't have to be overly heavy or have a lot of overhead to it. To me, this is how governance should work, and all of this should be done under the guidance and direction of a data steward or with the cooperation of it and within data governance programs. But as I talked about, we do have this gap between the expectations and the execution. And one of the gaps we talked about was whether or not data governance programs should be a separate entity in the organization chart. I have sort of a contentious feeling about this. I want data governance programs to be managed and executed by someone on the business side of the org chart. To me, that's where it belongs. It needs to be there. But one of the trade-offs with doing it that way is often there's this huge gap in knowledge, in skills, in tool usage, and the types of tools we would use in order to make those data governance standards workable in the real world of IT, where we have a lot of other things to worry about, like availability and cost and the ability to bridge that gap and tie business and all this together. And I think that that's the real struggle. This is where most data governance and stewardship programs fail, is in managing that gap. And in theory it shouldn't be a gap, but it's definitely a bridge where you need to be able to work together with business people and also be able to implement something in a technical fashion that allows us to execute that in the real constraints we have in technology. So we did spend a lot of time talking about that. One of the things is the politics of it all. So ideally, and I talk about this in the white paper, ideally I would love to see the concept of a data governance program just go away, not the efforts in them. But I don't think any other profession really separates out the governance and quality and compliance issues. If you think about traditional engineering and architecture, they don't have separate governance and things. It's baked right into their processes. Architects do plans, designers and CAD people do the designs, and there's a constant going back and forth between the end users, the architects, the engineers, the drafts people, and the builders to make this all happen. And throughout all the steps in a typical construction project or engineering project, these things are baked right into it. It's not a separate thing. So that, to me, is sort of the goal of where I'd like to see us take this. I have a question about what are the risks if data governance is led by technology department and not business? In my organization, data governance is part of technology, and we struggle to sell the concept of business. Very great question, very typical situation. To me, it's almost impossible to make that work if it's not owned by the business. It can work if the business people assigned to your data governance program feel and are able and have the authority to actually govern what IT is doing. So if IT is just providing sort of the facilities and overhead and budget line item for governance, but the business still feels that they have ownership of data governance, then it can work. That's an issue. So then your follow-up question, once stewards are identified and assigned, how do we get them engaged? So this is the other problem. A lot of times these business users have been volunteered into this position, and what happens is that often they've been assigned it and they've not taken ownership of it, and that's really hard. So someone had tweeted earlier today about something else, about if business executives are sponsoring something or assigning something, but their people aren't showing up to the meetings or being engaged, perhaps IT should just cancel the program until the business is otherwise engaged. Another point, data governance and stewardship should be a bridge to enforcing best practices. It should be run by a mix of IT and IS and the business people. So I definitely think it's a collaboration. I definitely think it's, it's important. The business can't carry off data governance without IT being involved and vice versa. I think in order for it to be a long-term success and not be cutting the budget line item for it every 6 months and everything, it really needs to be owned by the business. And in theory, the business owns even all of IT. But I really like it when there's true understanding that data governance isn't just something a bunch of data architects came up with in order to have a better title, but that it's something we certainly need to do. And someone else saying we found certain business IT roles need to be dotted lined back to each other. I agree with that. Can you speak to the other 90% of the world where every data governance concern mentioned today is handled in a small company by a single person and then only part-time? Wow, I hope part-time means at least 20 hours a day. A small company by a single person, I think maybe coordinated by or managed by or stewarded by is a good thing. I think when you have one person governing all the data, what you have are data systems that support that one person's view of the business, which is much better than having the business run by one developer's view of the business, which I have a case study about that I can't go into now. But I think that that's a really great discussion. I so wish we were having this in a live meeting with much more time. Yeah, shouldn't data governance be a collaboration between business and IT? Absolutely. And data stewardship is more of an IT role. It sounds like to me that you have a different definition of data stewardship. There are sort of architectural roles. Most data architects sort of fill a data stewardship role to a degree, but the type of data stewardship I'm talking about really is about how the business wants to spend its money, take its risks, and invest in data. An IT person really can't make those decisions on behalf of the business, and it really is a business question. I feel really strongly about that. Do you agree with me that business should own the data governance program, but IT implement it? I like that way of saying it. I think there are parts of it that are implemented on the business side as well. What's the difference between a steward and a subject matter expert? Well, subject matter expert in some places is just someone who can explain the business, but often has no authority to make decisions for the business. It's not true in all cases, but for instance, I have subject matter experts that tell me how things in the distribution center work, but they have no authority to decide for me exactly what an aisle bay bin is or what makes a warehouse and what's just a location in a warehouse. So I think you're describing the steward. I think the IT role is the custodian role. Now we're coming up with good labels. I like to think of it as an architect role, Dawn, but yeah, I've heard that term before too. Also librarian as well. Okay, so I'll skip across this one. So I'm just about running out of my time for this, but I wanted to hit on this, that one of the ways that I can help spread people understanding their data is by sharing data models via paper, via portal, via reports in ER Studio. There's lots of ways, and I find most of us using these tools tend to keep them to ourselves, and we need to spend more time sharing what we know about them. And there's one more shuttle picture of Discovery arriving at the Smithsonian. So where can you get help about these things? There's help actually in the Embarcadero products, which is actually quite good. I know we're not allowed to say that about help. We're all supposed to gripe about it, but it's good. You can get support through Embarcadero, through the forums, through my forums, and through third parties who consult on this stuff. And just as I'm wrapping up and handing it over to Saul, my summary is that we need to be doing data governance. You should go get the white paper that's going to be released soon or sent to you because you attended, and that it really is about bridging between IT and business, and that if we go and create this giant big program of data governance, it doesn't have nearly as likely a chance to succeed than if we just make sure that we're tying it all to business success. That's the best way to sell a data governance thing. So Saul, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great, thanks Karen. Let me grab the screen.
Yeah.
Good, and we should see ER Studio coming up on the screen here.
I see it.
Great, and I find I've got the same challenge, Karen, that you did, which is that what I really want to do is distill down about a 2-hour conversation into 10 minutes or so. As you can see, I've jumped into ER Studio, and I want to talk a little bit about the process of maturing a data model, and more specifically about using the data model to kind of piggyback on the existing conversation, to use that data model as a bridge between IT and the business. What I find is that the conversation we've heard today has been great, and it really refers back to a fairly well-established modeling process, and as a matter of fact, that contains very mature models that have complete object definitions, models that help us understand the business and the business rules that are currently established. But what I find in dealing with our customers is that very often that is not the status quo. Very often our customers are dealing with a scenario where that modeling process needs to be started. And while it's wonderful to talk about that top-down process of thinking about requirements gathering, of building conceptual models, distilling a logical model, et cetera, really very often the reality is that we're starting in a scenario where there are databases that are out there, and we need to figure out what data they contain. We need to figure out how to govern those databases or those data models. And I have a presentation that I like to show to customers where I actually walk through that process. And of course, we don't have the time today to step through that entirely. And so what I've done is I've short-circuited this a bit. I want to show you how we can start with an existing database and how we can use that to create documentation that, again, is going to allow us to bridge that gap between IT and between the business. So really, I've done two things here. One is that I've used ER Studio to connect to a database and reverse engineer that, creating a data model. And if you're familiar with ER Studio, you see a visual cue here as well. In the top right corner of this table, you see a kind of a computer monitor icon and a padlock. So I've taken 2 steps to help myself down the path. First is that I've simply gone to File, New inside of ER Studio. I've chosen the reverse engineer operation, and I've reverse engineered my database. And the second thing that I've done is I've added that data model, the result of that reverse engineer operation. So a very raw data model here. I've added that to my repository, and I've taken one critical step, which is that I've created an enterprise data dictionary, and I've linked or bound my data model to my enterprise data dictionary. So what I'm doing is just catching everyone up with where I sit currently. I've got a very raw data model, and inside of ER Studio, I have the concept of a data dictionary, which gives me access to a list or a library of reusable data objects. This is centralized within the repository, meaning I've got the ability to then go out and bind that to multiple data models so we can all share from the same standards. Now, why would I do that? What I'm looking at right now is the physical data model. And we can see that this is great technical documentation. So if I'm dealing with a DBA, if I'm talking to an ETL engineer, this is something that they can consume and understand. I can see my column names. I can see the data types, knowability. I've also added index information here. So again, as a developer, perhaps I need to understand what indexes are available to me, and I can access that directly through the data model. The problem I want to attack, though, is that we need to use the same documentation to work with the business. And as I take a look at that same data model, in this case, when I reverse engineer a model with ER Studio, it's going to generate both a logical and a physical model for me. And when I go and look at that logical model, I've taken the step to represent this as a model that shows just the entity names. I see that I have names that are difficult to understand. They're abbreviated. In some cases, they'll contain code values. And as a subject matter expert, as someone that knows the business well, but not necessarily knows the data model or the database well, I may not have a solid understanding of this model. It may be difficult for me to understand what some of these object names mean. So my first step is that I want to create a logical model that contains names that the business can understand. And how do I do that? How do I go to a database that contains abbreviated or code value names and translate that without a huge manual effort into understandable business terms? Well, within my Enterprise Data Dictionary, I've created what we call a naming standards template. And this is a dictionary which you create that allows you to map either code values to verbose names, or in my case, that allows me to map a name and an abbreviation together. So in this case, looking at the first example, account would either be abbreviated to ACT, or ACT can be expanded back to account. Again, the first thing I want to do is give my business user something that's understandable. And so what I'm going to do is simply update my model by running my naming standards utility, by attaching to that dictionary, and telling ER Studio to take those physical names and update those into business understandable logical names. And I'm running through here very quickly, but you can see the results here. I've now got the ability to show a business user, and what I've done is also created a submodel to focus on a smaller area of clarity here. But you can see that I've now got the ability, and we'll make sure that those full names are viewable, to begin to understand the data model. Now I no longer need to figure out the abbreviations, but instead I can see those full names. And in referring back to one of the slides that we saw earlier, one of our first tasks here is to ensure that not only do we have those full verbose names, but that we also have full business definitions as well. By the way, a question is coming in asking if the business names can contain spaces. Absolutely. In my case, word separation has been handled by casing. Certainly we can update that to show white space. We can translate a white space to an underscore. Whatever the case may be, that's all solvable through ER Studio. Now the problem is that the business definition here, and if I go to ER Studio and I say, okay, give me not just the name, but the definition of that object as well, this is a very typical scenario. What this is representing, what those empty boxes are representing, is that there are no business definitions contained within the database itself. And very often the challenge is that the person that understands the specific definition of employee pay history or even employee is someone that is not going to update the comments in the database. There's someone that's not going to attack the data model itself. And what we need to do is provide a medium that they can work within. Now I'm going to short-circuit this demonstration. Generally, I will go through an entire process of showing how to generate an Excel spreadsheet, which is done using the macro interface in ER Studio, how to update that spreadsheet, which we all know how to do anyway, and how to bring that right back into ER Studio. In my case, again, in the interest of time, what I'm simply going to do is use the endpoint of that demonstration, which is that I have a spreadsheet that contains those full definitions. And again, that's something I generate out of ER Studio and I pass off to my subject matter expert to complete for me. And all I need to do is to use ER Studio's VBA automation interface to point to that spreadsheet and say, hey, bring that in and show me an updated data model, please. So I'll run that update, and as you can see, we now have the ability to see that full verbose data model. So very quickly, we've been able to go from a scenario where we're seeing a very technical document to one where our users are able to read full names and understand the full definitions of our objects. In this case, we can see I mentioned the employee pay history, I think, was the definition that I used earlier, and of course, that's probably not the best example, but as you can see, you've got those full object definitions now resident in the data model. Now I want to take that one step further, and for some reason I'm having trouble getting to my web browser. Let me get this on screen. And I want to talk about how we can then allow our business users to interact with this data without ever seeing a data model. We don't need to train those users to understand the concept of, or the terminology for cardinality, for instance, because we can use the ER Studio web portal to run business reports for them. So what is this? What I've done again in ER Studio, and you can see from the icons on the screen here, is I've added my data model into the ER Studio repository. It does many things for me, but one of those benefits is that it's going to create a web portal which allows me to show HTML-based representations of my data model. So for instance, if I want to allow a user to explore that data model without ever having to install ER Studio, I can provide them access to the ERD, to the data model. And I'm doing this in my case through Firefox. You can see it's very easy for me to share this information. But again, more importantly, I want to talk about how we give a user access to the data contained within the data model without having to train them to use the data model. And I have a specific example I'd like to run here. I'm going to go to my report section here in the portal, and I want to run a business report. What I want to do is take the metadata contained in my relationship information, and I want to use that to generate a report that is going to document our business rules. So here I'm simply selecting information within the ER Studio web portal. I'm going to run a report, and once that report generates, I can then share that as a PDF document, as an Excel document, or I can link to it directly through ER Studio. And here's an example that I think that everyone can relate to here. I've got a business rule documented that tells me that each customer must relate to or must have 0 or more orders. Here's an example of a business rule that our subject matter expert can immediately read and understand, okay, we are in error. If a customer has not placed an order with us, if they have 0 orders, they are not a customer. In my case, I'm in a sales organization. We would term that individual a prospect. But the point is that simply by reading the full verbose business rule report here, our subject matter expert, our business analyst, is able to participate in the modeling process and able to communicate back to the data architect that we have a business rule that's in error. Now this, of course, is a very simple example, but I think that all of us can think of more complex rules where the architect may not be aware of the specific business rule in place, but where we need to engage with the business, with the subject matter expert, with the business analyst, whomever it might be, to point us back in the right direction. And given more time, my next step will be to walk you through how we actually use the portal as our collaboration engine. We actually have our business analyst then simply add a comment into the web portal, and that comment is going to feed its way right back into ER Studio Data Architect, where the architect can review that. So again, given the very short amount of time that we've had here, I've only had the ability to give you a quick highlight tour. But again, I want to give you some thoughts around how you can use a tool such as ER Studio to very easily move from that scenario where you have nothing but existing databases and to begin to incorporate business rules, business logic within those data models, and even communicate that information without using a data model, but communicate and collaborate over that information with our business compatriots. Karen, any last words from you?
I just wondered if you could spend 3 seconds. Isn't there an attachment for data stewardship or something
Absolutely
like that?
is.
That's the part I like.
Yeah. So what Karen is referring to is also within my data dictionary here. I've got the ability to create my own metadata tags. We term these attachments and data security tags. And in this case, you can see that one of the things that I can do is to begin to assign data stewardship, actually create assignments within the data model. And those, again, can be reviewed or run through the portal. So in this case, if we want to assign a design steward, here we're looking at the logical model, and we're looking at our employee entity. And since we have Karen available to us, we'll make sure that we're making good use of her time, and we'll assign Karen to be the steward for our employee object there. And I can simply go in and reveal that information through ER Studio. And I'm trying to resize that entity so we can see that. And we can create assignments through that process. And just like we saw the business report in the web portal, we can then run reports on assignment through the portal as well.
Exactly. That's my favorite part, that I can show the stewardship stuff right on the diagram and all kinds of stuff. And I can do amazing things with macros to highlight those. Like if I was reviewing this with one steward, I could highlight all the entities that they are responsible for stewarding. And that really makes it stand out for them. Yeah. So that's great.
Great. Well, again, we're a little time constrained here. Usually I talk about this subject for an hour to 2 hours as a starting point. But again, hopefully this gives you some good seeds, some good thoughts for ways in which you can leverage ER Studio to further your data governance projects.
Right. And I want to thank everyone for your excellent questions. I hope we got most of them addressed. I had a lot of fun answering them. I was glad that you were all there participating and engaging.
Thank you, everybody. We have now come to the end of our presentation. If you have any questions, you can feel free. And if you have any additional questions, you can feel free to contact Karen, or you could feel free to contact Solomon as well. His email address is solomon.waters@embarcadero.com. If you've missed any portion of this presentation, the recorded webinar is going to be made available to you within the next few days. On behalf of Embarcadero Technologies, I'd like to thank you all for attending today's event. Thank you.